Hi guys, welcome back to another endurance podcast. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Not enjoying the British winter having properly kicked in, but it happens every year, doesn't it? So
Yeah, I think I've started to just write indoors, and I have no plans whatsoever to go outside before February, probably.
even February is a bit early, maybe. I don't know. For you anyway. So today on the podcast, we've got a few questions that have been sent in by listeners, I think. And it's broadly on the theme of maltodextrin and what it is and why it's an important part of sports nutrition products in general. Um, so I guess a good way to start is, what is maltodextrin? Why is it different to other carbohydrates?
So yeah, very simply said, maltodextrin is basically a chain of glucose molecules, um, and we know that like we have simple sugars, which is like glucose, fructose, galactose, and then we also consider sucrose, like a um, table sugar as like a sugar. But maltodextrin is like a intermediate chain of intermediate length of glucose molecules. So it's not considered sugar as such, but it's also not considered a starch. Starch being like a complex carbohydrate source that we find in like pasta, rice, potatoes, and food ingredients like that. Whereas maltodextrin is made out of starch, but the chains of glucose molecules are a bit shorter. But at the same time, they're not as short as they are in just sugars, which is basically mono or disaccharides. So they have one or two sugar molecules bound together.
So it's a starch broken down into smaller sections of glucose molecules, but not as small as a monosaccharide or a disaccharide would be. So does that mean the properties of it are different to a sugar? Why is it not considered a sugar, even though it's just lots of smaller sugars joined together?
I think it's just a technical term, pretty much, because it behaves very, very similarly as glucose. So we have to make a difference between table sugar and glucose, because table sugar is basically a molecule of glucose and fructose bound together, and the metabolism of fructose and glucose our metabolisms are different, which means that table sugar, for instance, glycemic index, which is how much of a rise in glucose levels you get after eating a certain amount of glucose in the bloodstream, is not going to be as high as for maltodextrin, which is kind of, or glucose, which is just glucose. So maltodextrin behaves in the same way as glucose does. So it has a really high glycemic index. So after you eat it, it rapidly is broken down to glucose molecules, and these glucose molecules are then absorbed into the bloodstream and appear as glucose. So very simply, like it's pretty much the same as glucose. The only difference that we actually kind of sense or feel is that maltodextrin is not sweet or as sweet as glucose. So if you just had a maltodextrin drink without any sweeteners or without anything else added to it, it would have like a bit of a weird taste. Just it would be cloudy, but without like a very distinctive taste. Although the subsequent metabolism would be very, very similar.
So in the mouth, you'd notice it as a different taste, a different texture almost as well. But then once it's in the body and absorbed, it behaves exactly the same as glucose would.
Yeah, like in the mouth, the body would still recognize it probably as a carbohydrate source. So you would start producing saliva, which is a kind of relatively weak acid to break down the bonds of the carbohydrate bonds. And if you kind of have the maltodextrin solution for a long time in the mouth, you would probably start to break the bonds, and the solution might start to get sweeter and sweeter. But most of the time, you just don't feel that sweetness in the mouth, and the bonds are only broken down later.
Yeah. So you see a lot of supplements, sports supplements, and other just general foodstuffs that might be advertised as sugar-free, but they've got maltodextrin in instead. So as you said earlier, that's technically true because it's not technically a sugar, but and I guess taste-wise, it might not taste as sweet. But if that glucose is just swapped with maltodextrin, it's going to act the same once it's inside the body. Is that right?
Yeah, like I think this is kind of a misinformation for the customers because they kind of try to sell the product as being sugar free, so not contain the negatives that are associated with having sugars, whereas in reality, there is basically pretty much no difference and can be even worse. For instance, maltodextrin as compared to glucose would probably also have a negative effect on the health of the teeth. So from that perspective, there is no positive effects of having maltodextrin, and the subsequent metabolism is the same, meaning that the blood sugar rise will be exactly the same. The only difference being less sweet, which in certain scenarios is actually worse because making the beverage or any product less sweet might require people to have more of the same thing to get more sweetness. For instance, there are products out there that contain less sugar than the original product, so they replace some of the sugar for maltodextrin. So people like kids would just simply want to add more to get the same amount of taste for the same amount of taste, and by doing that, get more calories, which is what we actually want to avoid. But also, on the other hand, maltodextrin is on its own not sweet and not really pleasant. Of the taste is not really pleasant. So what manufacturers then do is add artificial sweeteners, which also probably are not the best thing to add into the product. So you avoid having the sugar for the sake of adding the artificial sugars, just to being able to say it's sugar free. I think it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, that leads really well into the next question we had, which was, can maltodextrin be bad for me in the long run? And I guess the answer to that is the same as, can sugar be bad for me in the long run, or maybe even, depending on how it's packaged, worse potentially, would you say?
Yeah, exactly. Like, there is no difference between, again, maltodextrin and glucose. It would be exactly the same. And in the long run, any kind of ingredient that will make you be in energy surplus is probably not good for you. Be it, I don't know, fats, be it carbohydrates, sugars, starch, whatever, really. So in terms of like athletes require quick release carbohydrates because you're actually in energy deficit during exercise and you want to avoid that. So it's not that just like energy surplus is the problem. In athletes, we have an energy deficit. That's the problem. So it really depends, and it's down to the context, what is good and what is bad for certain situation.
Yeah. So it's not the same characteristics really of maltodextrin that make it potentially not the best for a sedentary person. If it's going to mean it's not going to taste as sweet, they're going to want more of it to have that same feeling, that same satiety. That's why we like it almost in sports nutrition because it's not got that sickly sweet flavor you would get if you just drank really highly concentrated glucose or sugar solution. So it's going to help you take on enough, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Like in sports nutrition, we use it partly because it's less sweet, so we can add some like fructose, which is very sweet to it, and the end solution will not be as sweet as a combination of like fructose and glucose would have been. But at the same time, there is another benefit which is more complicated to explain, but basically it's about the osmolarity or osmolality of the solution, which is basically a measure of how many particles there are dissolved in a certain solution. So the more concentrated the solution, so let's say you put 100 grams of carbohydrates into a 1 liter of liquid, and if you had just glucose molecules, so just using glucose powder, there would be a lot of glucose particles in this solution. Whereas if you used maltodextrin, for instance, which has, I don't know, chains of like 10 glucose molecules together, the number of particles in this solution would be 10 times less. And this is kind of can be good in terms of hydration perspective, from the hydration perspective, because too high of an osmolality will reduce the hydration properties of the solution. So the water will have more difficulties going from the small intestine or from the gut into the bloodstream. Whereas if the osmolality is low, the hydrating properties will be better. And this is kind of why we use maltodextrin very often in sports nutrition products.
Yeah, that's, I guess, I remember products back from sort of the 80s, and you can still get it now, but not in the same form, the Lucozade Original. And that was more for people who were ill or, you can't get much energy and keep it down. So you'd have this really highly concentrated glucose drink, and it was 18% glucose. And then the sports versions came along, which obviously dropped that glucose content down a lot and added electrolytes in to help improve the hydration side of things. But if you try to use that Lucozade original as a sports drink, you wouldn't be able to hydrate yourself very well just because of that super high glucose concentration. Whereas these days you can get similar concentration sports drinks out there because they're made with maltodextrin and fructose. It doesn't have that same effect on your hydration, so you can get the best of both worlds, getting the carbohydrates in and also getting the fluids in at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like a lot of fine tuning, and also like a lot of the time in the past, GI issues were caused because of having too highly concentrated drinks or gels. Like say the first gels that were out there, they basically were made out of glucose syrup, and that made the osmolarity really high, and that also caused gastrointestinal problems. Whereas these days we use a lot of maltodextrin, so the osmolarity is lower, and as a result of that, like GI issues are less prevalent.
Yeah, a lot of those original gels would say you have to drink a certain amount of water with each gel. So essentially, you're kind of making a sports drink in your stomach rather than having the gel in itself as a source, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So another question related to maltodextrin, and this is a bit more again technical. I think it's related to the osmolarity. Asks what is the dextrose equivalent, and why is that important for maltodextrins?
So maltodextrin, like equivalent, is basically tells us how kind of how many molecules or like if they're bound together in one chain of maltodextrin, and the higher the number, so for instance 17 to 20, that would mean that there are less or smaller or shorter chains of glucose molecules bound together, whereas the lower number would mean that the chains would be longer. Basically you get the numbers from, I don't know, like maltodextrins are classified and have a D number between 3 and 20. So above 20, it's called basically a glucose syrup, and if you go below 3, it's basically called a starch. But basically, the lower number, the longer the chain. So this means, from the perspective of metabolism, that you have to break this chain like many more times before you basically reduce it to just glucose molecules, and will be as the sweetness will be even lower, the osmolarity will be even lower as well. So there could be some benefits from having a low like D index, but at the same time, the problem becomes that very like long chains don't really dissolve well in sports drinks. So very often the sports nutrition products will contain DE values of between 7 to 9 to 20, which is maltodextrin with short chains, which will kind of dissolve really quickly in the water, but also the breakage of the bonds between glucose molecules will be very, very rapid, whereas the longer the chains, perhaps we can actually see a reduction in how the kinetics of breakage of these bonds. So these kind of differences between different maltodextrins are very, very small from the metabolism perspective. So there is like almost impossible to do a study to see any differences between different maltodextrins, and it's basically then you end up deciding what is best to actually get the product tasting the best and actually dissolving in the easiest way. So for instance, maltodextrin that Nduranz uses, I think it's 17 to 20, so which is kind of almost bordering to glucose syrup, which still makes it less sweet, or pretty much as little sweetness as possible, just coming from maltodextrin. But at the same time, also the osmolarity would be relatively lower compared to glucose only, kind of the solubility in the liquid once you mix the drink is really good. I don't really see any point of like going to like longer chains, or basically there is no like metabolism differences really. So this is just how sports nutrition actually is.
And there wouldn't be any difference in, say, the sort of texture of a gel that it would make by using the longer chain, lower dextrose equivalent maltodextrins.
I think
not enough to make noticeable difference.
Yeah, for if you start like making the gel with like longer chains of glucose, you might really start to struggle to actually pack 45 grams of like carbohydrates in the small amount of water that we have. So that was kind of part of the reason. And I think once the gels were designed or like developed, there were like kind of quite a lot of play on using different types of maltodextrins, and it turned out that basically for what we need, like the DE value that is the highest is actually much better, because otherwise you don't dissolve the maltodextrin, but you also like the texture becomes a bit more cloudy and less pleasant, I think, also the taste wise.
Okay. So obviously most modern sports drinks aren't just one source of carbohydrates anymore. You don't get just maltodextrin in many products. But why do we then go in and add fructose? You mentioned before the sweetness, extra carbohydrates, the absorption.
So yeah, when I usually describe or discuss different types of carbohydrates, I just say make a distinction between glucose and fructose-based carbohydrates. And when I say glucose-based carbohydrate, I also consider maltodextrin to be part of that group. So glucose-based carbohydrates, we know that the ability to absorb and utilize these carbohydrates during exercise has an upper limitation of around, 40, 50, 60, 70 grams per hour in different individuals. And even though we would eat more of that, 100 grams an hour, we would simply not be able to utilize that as an energy source. So it would be kind of pointless to have more. Whereas if we had fructose, whose metabolism is a bit different, we can actually see an increased reliance on these exogenous, we call them, or carbohydrates, so the carbohydrates coming from the drink. So, for instance, if you were to have like 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour, and you would have 90 grams of carbohydrates from maltodextrin or glucose only, you would only be able to oxidize around 60 grams of that. If you had 90 grams and a combination of glucose and fructose, then you can probably oxidize pretty much all of it because, the special metabolism properties of fructose allow that. So this is like different absorption mechanisms using different transporters, but also subsequent metabolism in the blood is different to the glucose. So there are many benefits of why it is better to use a combination of both types of carbohydrates. The problem again here is that fructose, is a bit sweeter. So you definitely want to use maltodextrin for the glucose-based carbohydrate source, because otherwise the solution would become too sweet, because fructose is even sweeter than glucose itself.
So would, obviously that's the case for relatively high intakes if you want to take on over 60 grams per hour. If you wanted to take on less than 60 grams, would you still go glucose fructose there ideally, or is it less important? Or
in most cases, most scenarios, there probably wouldn't be any difference if having just 40 grams of glucose per hour. But I usually say that it's better to have always the same ratio of carbohydrates. So in the Nduranz case, it would be 1 to 0.8. And the reason being is, first of all, you're always using the same product. So you're used to the type of carbohydrate, the type of the product. So you only have one type of the product in your cupboard at home rather than different ones. But also there is evidence that there is less chance of having GI issues with having a combination of both types of carbohydrates. And from that perspective, I think it kind of makes sense to always be using the ratio, although it's not as important as when you go above 60 grams per hour, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Would you say those higher GI issues are due to kind of the glucose transporters being closer to being saturated if you were taking on just maltodextrin, or is there another reason behind that, do you think?
Yeah, it's probably that. It's simply when you combine both, you can utilize a higher number of transporters and get the carbohydrates at the quicker rate out of the intestines, and those by doing that reduce the potential problems.
Okay. And then the final question we've had in leads on quite nicely from that. And you mentioned that 1 to 0.8 ratio between maltodextrin and fructose, and it's not a number that would come off the top of your head of when you were designing something. What's the background behind that? Why is it that ratio?
So initially, like when people were investigating these different types of carbohydrates, they kind of first determined, well, we can only oxidize around 60 grams of glucose per hour, or around 60 grams of maltodextrin per hour. And they were then thinking about adding different types of carbohydrates or fructose into the mix, because it was found out that fructose using a different transporter. So if from the intestine into the bloodstream. So if the transport is the limitation, the obvious question is then perhaps we can add some fructose or substitute some of the glucose for fructose at rates above 60 grams an hour, and then perhaps we can get higher rates. So the easiest question was to an easier design to answer this question would be, okay, let's just have 90 grams of glucose per hour, or have 60 grams of glucose plus 30 grams of fructose, 2-to-1 ratio, because it was always believed that fructose metabolism is less efficient than of glucose, a smaller number of transporters, and also more complicated subsequent metabolism in the bloodstream. But anyway, they started using this 2-to-1 ratio just for the basically testing purposes, like research purposes. And they found out, yes, when you add fructose to the mix, you get higher utilization rates of ingested carbohydrates. So great. And then most of the time, everyone was just using this 2-to-1 ratio. But then a researcher from New Zealand, so David Rowlands, he started exploring how can we kind of optimize this ratio, or what actually is the optimal ratio, because at first they were just using 2-to-1. And then he started looking at these different combinations, did a few research papers, and actually found out that probably the best ratio would be more 1-to-1 than 2-to-1. So he started looking at research and doing research in this area, and found out probably that 1-to-0.8 is the best in terms of how efficiently you can utilize the ingested carbohydrates at these ratios for the same amount of carbohydrates given to the person, be it 70 grams an hour or be it 90 grams an hour. But also at the same time, you also get least amount of gastrointestinal discomfort. So it's more pleasant, or most pleasant, to the stomach or the intestines. And this is kind of the reason why we went with 1-to-0.8 at Nduranz, because we wanted to be actually evidence-based and learn from the evidence. So this is kind of the background story about behind it.
Yeah, so it's based on what researchers has said is the optimal ratio that we know at the moment, and that's kind of, there's a lot of other companies now followed on and using similar ratios, aren't there?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's covered all the questions that we've had. So hopefully everyone who's listening has found that interesting. Maybe they've come up with some more. You've come up with some more questions that you'd like to ask, either to follow on from that or go in a different direction. So yeah, please send in your questions, and we'll see if we can put them into another little subject for the next podcast.